Hi, Shopaholics! I'm Selena, and welcome to the third episode of Confessions of a Shopaholic. In the previous episode, Kez walked us through impulse buying, those sudden checkout moments when we say things like, deserve ko to, without really thinking twice. She showed us how emotions can push us to buy things even before we fully process the decision. Now, in this episode, we go one level deeper. Because the real question is not just why we buy things impulsively, but why we keep justifying it afterward. Why does deserve ko to not just appear once, but start becoming a belief we rely on? Let's talk about self-reward justification. So, to begin, consider a familiar situation. After a long, stressful day, individuals often think, hala, parang deserve ko ng Zeus coffee. Parang I wanna buy peach iced tea from Pickup Coffee. And in that moment, the thought feels reasonable. It feels even comforting because it provides a sense of relief or, validation after experiencing stress and emotional discomfort such as, fatigue from school or from work. But this situation raises an important question. Are individuals genuinely engaging in self reward as a form of healthy reinforcement? Or are they just using consumption as a way to regulate emotions that they are unable to process directly? So, this distinction is crucial in understanding emotional spending behavior. So, from a behavior change perspective, emotional spending is best understood as a cyclical process rather than an isolated action. So, the cycle typically begins with an emotional or situational trigger such as stress, fatigue from work or school, boredom, or dissatisfaction, which is followed by a cognitive process often expressed as I deserve this or deserve ko ng Zeus coffee. And then the behavior occurs, purchasing an item or engaging in consumption, and immediately afterward, individuals often experience temporary relief or pleasure. So this sense of relief or sense of pleasure serves as a form of reinforcement, which signals our brain that the behavior was effective in reducing discomfort. As a result, when a similar emotional state arises in the future, the same behavioral response is more likely to occur again. In another perspective, from a cognitive behavioral therapy perspective, this explains that this process through the interaction between thoughts, emotions, and behavior occur in purchasing items, for example. And according to this framework, cognition plays as a central role in shaping emotional and behavioral processes. So in this context, yung thought na deserve ko to or I deserve this acts as the initial cognitive trigger. This thought influences emotional states such as relief, satisfaction, or comfort, and these emotions then lead to behavioral outcomes such as purchasing behavior. Therefore, CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy emphasizes that emotional spending is not primarily driven by the behavior itself, but by the underlying cognitive processes that precede it. In another note, rational emotive behavior therapy or REBT provides further insight into this process by showing us the role of irrational beliefs. So these beliefs are cognitive distortions that appear logical on the surface or in the moment but are fundamentally inaccurate or exaggerated in nature. So for example, when I say, hala, I had a bad day, therefore, kailangan kong i-reward yung self ko. This shows that there is a rigid, demand-based belief system because you need to reward yourself for you to feel pleasure. Another example is that when you say, pag hindi ko to bibilhin, I'll regret this forever. Ito naman, this shows catastrophizing or exaggerated anticipation of negative outcomes. Third example is when we say, I deserve this no matter what. Ito naman, this reflects absolutist thinking where behavior is justified without evaluation of context or consequences. And these irrational beliefs actually contribute significantly to emotional decision making and behavioral justifications. From a behavioral perspective, the persistence of this cycle can be explained through reinforcement. So, each time an individual engages in purchasing behavior and experiences emotional relief, that relief functions as a positive reinforcement, and the brain associates the behavior with a reduction of negative emotional states. As a result, the likelihood of repeating that behavior in similar emotional contexts increases. And then over time, this creates a learned behavioral pattern in which consumption becomes a coping mechanism for emotional regulation rather than purely functional decision. So, as this cycle continues, the behavior becomes increasingly automatic. Individuals may no longer consciously evaluate their decisions before engaging in purchasing behavior. And from an REBT perspective, this is linked to the concept of self rehearsal. A repeated internal statement such as, deserve ko to, or I deserve this, reinforce the belief system over time. And as these beliefs become more ingrained towards an individual, they require less conscious effort to activate, making the behavior more habitual and less critically examined. So, at this point, it is important for us to distinguish between adaptive and maladaptive forms of self reward. Healthy self reward is intentional, it is planned, and it is aligned with personal goals or achievements. It functions as a form of positive reinforcement that supports motivation and well being. However, on the other hand naman, maladaptive self-reward is primarily emotional driven. It is impulsive. It is often used as a means of, avoiding or escaping negative emotional distress. The key distinction does not lie in the act of rewarding itself, but in the psychological function that the behavior serves. So, to further understand this behavior, reflection is really, really essential. Consider your most recent instance of deserve ko to purchase. It's important for us to ask what emotional state was present at that time. Was the purchase driven by actual necessity or emotional regulation? Or, was it primarily an attempt to alter or escape a negative emotional experience? So, this type of reflection allows individuals to identify patterns that may otherwise remain unconscious. So, in terms of behavior change, several strategies can actually can be applied to interrupt this cycle. So, first, we have cognitive awareness, um, which involves identifying and questioning automatic thoughts such as, kailangan ko ba talaga to or am I responding emotionally? Second, behavioral delay, which introduces a time gap between impulse and action, which allows emotional intensity to decrease before making a decision. Third, behavioral replacement, which encourages the substitution of purchasing behavior with alternative coping strategies such as rest, social interaction, or other non material forms of emotional regulation. So, these strategies aim to weaken the reinforcement loop over time. In summary, not all emotional experiences require material responses. In many cases, emotional awareness and understanding may be more beneficial than immediate behavioral gratification. So, by recognizing this pattern, individuals can begin to reduce automatic associations between emotion and consumption, which leads to more intentional decision making. And up to this point, the decision has focused on internal cognitive and behavioral responses, including thoughts, beliefs, and reinforcement mechanism. However, it is also important for us to recognize that these internal justifications do not develop in isolation. They are significantly influenced by external factors such as our social media exposure, our peer behavior, and cultural norms surrounding consumption and self reward. Therefore, understanding emotional spending requires not only examining external recognition or internal recognition, but also the external environment that shapes and reinforces these cognitive responses or patterns, which will be further discussed in the next session on social and cultural influences.